Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. My name's Eileen Yam, and I'm the Managing Director of Science and Society Research at Pew Research Center. And we've been tracking trends in Americans' trust in scientists for about a decade. And we're really excited to share our latest data with you here today. But first, I want to extend a special thanks to AAAS for organizing and hosting this event. We're really grateful for this opportunity to share our work with the broader AAAS community. And relatedly, please note this webinar is being live streamed and recorded on the AAAS YouTube channel. So today we'll start with a presentation on these new Pew data by my colleague, Alec Tyson, who is Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center. And then following his presentation, we'll have a stellar panel of experts who will discuss the implications of this research. We'll be joined by Sudip Parikh, who is AAAS CEO and Executive Publisher of the Science family of journals, Holden Thorpe, Science Journal's Editor-in-Chief, and Kathleen Hall Jamieson, AAAS Board Member and Director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Jamieson is an expert on science communication and combating misinformation. So now I'll remove myself from the screen and pass the mic to Alec. Welcome, Alec.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I should be sharing my screen now. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to be here. If you don't know us at the Pew Research Center, we are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy organization, and part of our mission is to inject data-informed research into public conversations. And to that end, we're very excited to share with you our latest findings just out today on public trust in scientists and broader views in their role in making science policy. So let's jump right into the data. The first place I want to start here is with this idea of trust in science or trust in scientists. It's a big concept. There's more than one way to measure it. The approach that we've taken at the center is a fairly straightforward question that you see in the subhead of this slide, which is to say, how much confidence do you have in scientists to act in the best interest of the public? A great deal, that's shown in the dark blue of the chart, a fair amount, shown in the light blue, or not too much or none at all. And we net those and combine them and show them in green. And I should say what you're looking at is nationally representative public opinion data, the views of all US adults. So when you look at our confidence data, and this is a trend over time, you see a couple of things. One, the decline in trust or decline in confidence that occurred over the COVID-19 pandemic. A high of 87% of US adults had either a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists in April of 2020. If you'll remember, this is the very early stages of the pandemic. That level of overall confidence fell to 73% by October of 2023. That's a pretty sizable 14-point decline. But what we're sharing with you today in our newest data is a statistically significant slight uptick. It's a 3-point increase from 73% with this overall level of confidence last fall to 76% in the current survey. So let's bring in data among Republicans and Democrats. And we could spend 5 or 10 minutes looking just at these data, but a few big points that I want to make. One of them, larger majorities of Democrats than Republicans express confidence in scientists, right? That's the 88 versus 66%. But what I also want to draw your attention to is among Republicans, the share with a great deal or a fair amount of confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public is up 5 points in the last year. That's a statistically significant uptick and the first increase we've seen among Republicans since the pandemic. And if we were to step back for a minute and think, and looking at this data and think, what is part of the equation for scientists returning to the level of confidence with the public they had prior to the pandemic? Well, improving or regaining trust with Republicans is a big part of that equation because of how steeply and sharply trust had fallen among that group during the pandemic. And that's hopefully evident on the visual on your screen in front of you. We often get asked how scientists compare with other prominent groups and institutions in society, and the answer is a pretty positive one. They have very strong relative standing. Half of our sample gets asked about medical scientists. The other half of the sample gets asked about scientists. This is the same question of confidence or trust. You can see those two groups are viewed very similarly, and they're viewed more positively than many other prominent groups, including business leaders, religious leaders, journalists, and even a bit more positive than groups like police officers and public school principals, who enjoy pretty positive ratings themselves. We were looking at some of the Q&A submitted before this event, some questions about how views of scientists in this country compare around the world. It's hard to generalize too broadly, but based on a 2019 study we did, we saw more similarities than differences. And what I mean by that, and in the 19 or 20 publics we surveyed, majorities had at least some trust in scientists, and scientists were held in relatively high regard relative to other groups. There's a very interesting preprint article that I read recently that I think is very nuanced, but I think makes some of the similar points that there's more similarity here in large shares around the world generally having trust in scientists. Let's pivot here to the survey that explored some of the perceptions of research scientists' traits and characteristics. You could think of that of maybe their public image, right? Another way of saying that. We asked about 10 traits or characteristics, and it's a very simple question among US adults. Do you think each of the statements describes research scientists well, or don't you think that, right? And right at the top of the chart, there's some really positive assessments here. Almost 9 in 10 Americans view research scientists as intelligent. You also see pretty clear majorities ascribing other positive traits, like focused on solving real-world problems or honest. You know, worth noting, these are smaller majorities, not quite as widespread as that 89%, but still a pretty positive assessment here. One area where we see some weaker ratings is around this issue of communication, certainly a point of emphasis within the field and much good work being done around scientific communication. Nonetheless, for Americans, fewer than half view research scientists as good communicators, 45%. And that is down 9 points since 2019, a pre-pandemic measure we had on the same question. Another trait I draw your attention to is this feel superior to others. 47% of Americans view research scientists that way. And that's one to think about or reflect on. Is there room for research scientists or this public image to be seen as more connected with the everyday concerns or issues that people face in their own life? Here we have a selection of those same characteristics shown the views of Republicans and Democrats. Right off the bat, there's really a bipartisan sense that research scientists are viewed as intelligent. It's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's worth pausing here for a minute to say in our work on views of science and scientists, there are some really interesting points of bipartisan agreement. And a few of those I can share briefly is a sense that it's important for the US to be a leader in scientific achievement. Large shares of Republicans and Democrats believe that. And while the size of the majorities differ somewhat, both Republicans and Democrats think that federal investments in basic scientific research, that basically they're worthwhile investments. So a bit of a sidebar, but to say there are some clear areas of bipartisan support for scientists and science, right? As we move down this slide, we do see some differences here. The sense of being focused on real world problems. Most Democrats say that describes research scientists well. Republicans less so, pretty evenly split decision on that. Almost as many say they don't view research scientists this way. Communication is really a weak point for both Republicans and Democrats. There is a difference as you see on the screen, but in a way, Democrats give such strong ratings of scientists across dimensions that 54% on good communication is a pretty tepid assessment in context. And then for Republicans, a majority say they don't view research scientists this way. And then here again, we return to this trait of feel superior to others. And I think it's worth pointing to this, that a majority of Republicans hold this impression that research scientists feel superior to others. I think that's worth reflecting on when you're trying to put some of the puzzle pieces together about what's behind some of these views and how do they fit together. The last segment of my presentation is to touch on policy, the policy role for scientists. What role do Americans want scientists to play in shaping policy? This question is a fairly blunt one, but it's really effective at revealing a general orientation of a respondent. And it reads, in effect, do you think scientists should focus on establishing scientific facts and also take an active role in public policy debates on science issues? Or do you want scientists to focus on establishing sound scientific facts and really largely stay out of policy debates? And it's a question that divides the public roughly into two even camps. 51% want this more active policy engagement role, and 48% would prefer that scientists largely stay out of those debates. If we want to think a bit for a moment about the implications of the downtake in confidence or trust that we saw during the pandemic, This is one potential example. What you have at the bottom is a time series, and you can see that there was much more widespread public support for an active policy role for scientists before the pandemic in January of 19 and May 20, when about 60% took that view. And another point I want to make on this slide is it really is an area where Republicans and Democrats express competing or different visions, is the way to put it, different visions for the policy role of scientists. Two-thirds of Democrats want scientists to play an active role engaging in policy debates. Almost as many Republicans, 64%, say the opposite and say they prefer for scientists to stay out of these policy debates. So an interesting difference of opinion on this question. The last slide I have for you here goes a little further on this policy engagement question, and it asks folks to assess, do you think scientists are usually better or worse than other people at making good policy decisions about scientific issues? One way to read this data is that fewer than half view scientists as usually better, right? And I think that's interesting to think about for a minute, that Americans aren't convinced that scientists typically make better science policy decisions than other people. Now, here again, you do see this party divide. Democrats are more confident, Republicans are more skeptical. But we ask this question as a way of trying to understand a little bit more deeply why folks might be split on this overall policy engagement role. So that's the end of my presentation. I really look forward to the conversation we're about to have, and you can find this report in more detail on our website. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Eileen.
Thanks so much, Alex. So interesting and so much to talk about. So now I'd like to invite our three panelists to turn on their cameras to start our discussion. Welcome back, Sudip, Holden, and Kathleen. So let's start by talking about science communication and trust in scientists. I'll start with Sudip for this one. We just heard how nationally trust in scientists is slightly up from a year ago, but hasn't returned to pre-pandemic levels. And we all know that during the pandemic, science communication was really put to a test. And we see in this data that communication is still not really considered a strong suit of scientists. So, Sudip, from where you sit, what does it even mean to be an effective science communicator? And does that look different at the national versus local levels?
Yeah, thanks for that. Well, first of all, let me just say that data is really interesting and fascinating to discuss. I'm glad we're doing it. The two things that stood out to me from that were the feel superior to others, and the fact that half of respondents didn't think that scientists were good communicators. And those two things pain me. They pain me to my core because, as you know, when you talk about what makes a good science communicator, the most important thing is, can you actually get across the science as it's understood by the scientist? And that requires knowing your audience and then also being able to engage with them. And if they think that you're feeling superior to them, then they're not going to engage. So the first thing is humility. Humility is an absolute requirement for science communication. If you can't be humble about the fact that science is done by humans, and we are subject to all the fallibility and all the extraordinary talents that all humans have, then you can't relate. The second is knowing that you have to listen in order to share. You have to listen in order to be able to have a conversation with somebody. Those are the kinds of things that are required as traits. Now, when you talk about the difference between national communicators and local communicators, I think there's a really big difference. National communicators, you have to speak through this kind of a medium, either something with technology, something on television, and that requires a different set of skills than being at the local level where you can build relationships over time. Some of the most trusted scientists in America are probably our agriculture extension folks who work in local communities around in farming communities. Why? Because they are building relationships over time. So even if you are socially awkward, and sure, I'm sure some of us are, that doesn't matter as much because you're building a relationship over time, and that's incredibly powerful. So I hope that we can turn around the feeling superior to others and good communicator part, because that's the basis of building trust.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I love that humility and listening, irrespective of its local or national. And locally, it's the relationships over time. National, the medium really matters. And I think that's something that is a nice setup for my next question for Holden, which is about these traits and characteristics. scientists being perceived as intelligent but with a sense of superiority. You shared in your writing some pretty strong views about how it's scientists are the ones who need to also restore trust by earning it. And in your experience in academia with the science journals, what's this relationship between trust in science and the perception of research scientists as intellectual elites?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, there are some important lessons for us all here. And as I've said, pretty forthrightly the last year or so, we made some mistakes during the pandemic. And I think that, or I did, and a lot of other scientists. And I think while that is something we need to change in the future, it's also understandable. We were scared, and it was a very emotional time, and it underlines the fact that we're human beings. And all of this really comes down to that in the end. Now, in terms of what you're saying, I've said we need respect within the world of science before we're going to be able to project humility to the world. And unfortunately, there are a lot of scientists who think that they can do everything, that they're good in the lab, that they can write papers, that they can get grants, and they can go on TV and explain science to people who don't think about science nearly as much as they do. And that's a shame because there's a whole world fostered by the AAAS and many others of people who are specialists in communicating. And if the scientists would be willing to respect those folks just as much as they respect people who produce research findings, then we could partner with them to put forward the right messages and in the right way for the public. So yes, scientists feel superior, and they also feel superior to each other and to many people in the scientific community. It goes with the passion and excitement and drive that they have to do this. And it goes with their humanity, which is what we're here to talk about. But my solution to this has always been, even during the pandemic, a much more deliberate partnership with outstanding science communicators than it is with trying to get people who are good at all these other things to suddenly become good at public communication, which I think is something people have talked about a long time and we haven't realized.
Yeah, I think a lot of our communications colleagues who have joined, they feel seen in hearing you speak. And the recurring theme I'm hearing from both you and Sudip so far is this idea of, we're humans too, and there is a humility that needs to be expressed and appreciated that from what I'm hearing from both of you is pretty fundamental to building trust, regardless of whether we're talking about academic publishing, local level, national level. I want to pause for a moment to invite audience members as we're having our discussion to go ahead and start entering questions into the Q&A. And when we get to that segment, we'll be sure to be reviewing them to incorporate them into our Q&A as the time allows. So now I'd really love to hear from Kathleen on this adjacent thread about miscommunication. So we know scientists alone aren't the sole messengers of science, and there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there by many messengers on many platforms. So for everyone involved in communicating science, trying to build trust in science, how should they best navigate this information ecosystem?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember that most research scientists don't communicate to the public. They communicate to each other. And when they're communicating to each other, they're speaking in a language that is highly concise and very technical, because that's very efficient. But when that language moves out into public, because we have emerging knowledge, and now suddenly they're being called upon, and others are being called upon to represent their work, sometimes they forget that the language that they speak to each other is not the language of the public. And so when they use words like luciferase or lipid nanoparticles, There's already an association out in the world with nanoparticles, and it has nothing to do with the nanoparticle as it is conceived by the scientists. And luciferase has the word Lucifer in it. So there are times in which the vocabulary moves out without an awareness of how that language is used in the public at large. So as we move scientific knowledge, we need to ask, what does the public hear when people talk? And have we translated so that the meaning that we're trying to convey is the meaning that is heard? In a world in which we don't have a whole lot of technical knowledge in the public, but we have a lot of intelligence, it's also important that scientists ask, are we inadvertently increasing susceptibility to misunderstanding by the way we talk? So, for example, when someone says there are many thousands of deaths reported in the vaccine adverse event reporting system as a result of vaccination, and you hear as a result of, the scientist would say, no, wait, the vaccine adverse event reporting system doesn't get causal associations between the vaccine and the event. It's simply a great monitoring system to find any possible problem. And then scientists come back in from all the available other databases to find out whether what they're seeing as this signal is actually real and is worrisome to the population. But when they use the language vaccine adverse event reporting system, they've already implied in the language there's a causal connection that isn't there. Now, the scientists all know it's not there, but how would the public know that? And then when someone draws perhaps an innocent, misinformed inference that because it's there and reported, it must be causal, the language is in getting the way of understanding that, no, this is just a monitoring system. And when we call it the vaccine adverse event reporting system singular, people think, oh, that must be it. It's the system. And they don't understand, no, it's an early warning part, a monitoring part of a much bigger system. And as a result, it isn't really the system. It's a piece of a system. I'm using that as an illustration because if you look at the number of times there's a misunderstanding, sometimes innocent misunderstanding, of what the data in that database mean, and we want transparency, we want data accessibility, so we want it there. If we haven't clarified by getting the right name on the monitor, it becomes more difficult for people to understand what they're actually hearing. And when people have ill intent and are trying to misconstrue the data, it makes it easier for them to land that inference. So my message in this environment is hear from the perspective of what the public hears. And we need to be humble enough to recognize that that language is a very appropriate way to interpret what we say. It's our job to get that into a language that's understandable. It's not the public's job to figure out what it is we intended to say. What they're hearing is what we're saying. We just say it in a way that doesn't increase susceptibility to misconstrual and misconception.
Yeah, there's that point about being humble and humility again. And I think you're exactly right. I was trained in health sciences, public health. So adverse event reporting means something very intuitive to people who spend their days and hours and lives talking to each other about it. But to your point, scientists aren't the best. In my experience as a public health researcher, at kind of thinking, wait a minute, not everyone is like me. This is not all a jury of my peers. So point well taken. This next question I have is actually for all of you. I'd like to give each of you a chance to respond. I'll start with Sudip on this. Getting back to the general public and their day-to-day, which is not like that of research scientists. So the general public engages in science knowingly or unknowingly in so many different ways in everyday life. So not everyone is attending these webinars or reading science news, for example. So what are some of the ways by which the public engages with, is exposed to science, and how might those experiences or mechanisms either bolster or diminish trust? So Sudip, what are your thoughts on that, the everyday engagement?
Yeah. It's interesting, the everyday engagement that people have where science is working and technology is working is so hidden from view from them that they don't even recognize it. I don't recognize it. When I get up in the morning and I check my phone, I'm not thinking about the hundreds of advances that are sitting inside there. And it just works. And so the places that should be building trust sometimes aren't even recognized as science and technology. And these things that work, almost all the time, 99.999% of the time. And then some of the areas where we have the most gray, the places where we've got to talk in terms of the weather forecasting, and where, it's the thing where we say, gosh, why is it never right when I want it to be right? Even though it is, if you look at it, and the 3-day forecast is really very good now, much, much better than it was even 20 years ago. We see the failures much more easily. And we often talk about some public health. When public health is working, it's quiet. It's so quiet. It doesn't occur to us that it's working. So we have to work our way through that. I can't help but after Kathleen mentioned luciferase, I can't help but mention in another parallel timeline somewhere, one of the enzymes that was being used in this whole discussion about COVID would have been Sonic Hedgehog, which is a different enzyme. And I have to think, what isn't it random that one enzyme is being used and it has that name, and then there's another like Sonic Hedgehog, which is again named after a video game. And what would that world have been like? And this shouldn't be random. We should, as scientists, be thinking about how does it land.
Yeah, I think first of all, during the pandemic, people were consuming much more science news than at any other time, probably in history, because they were at home, they were watching TV, or they were looking at social media, and we had certain figures who were on for hours and hours and hours and hours. And of course, if you now go back to all of that video, you find that these fallible human beings weren't perfect for all those thousands of hours that they were on television, and weren't perfect in terms of what was shared on social media. And so I think that is playing a big role in the data that we're seeing here, and maybe we're seeing a little bit of recovery from that. But I think in general, the other huge thing that's happening is that people are getting their information in different ways or not at all. And we tend to think, because we have a great effort here called the Science Press Package that gets a lot of news coverage for our articles in very broad outlets. But a lot of people aren't reading newspapers anymore. I mean, that's why there's so much turmoil in their industry. And a lot of people are getting their news from social media, and now not even from Facebook anymore. They're getting it from TikTok. We just had an organic chemistry paper where the views were much larger than we ever see for organic chemistry. It was the top paper in our issue last week. We hardly ever see this. And when we dug into why, it turns out there was a viral TikTok video about that paper. And so I think we're all a little, to varying degrees across the scientific enterprise, very slow to understand the way in which our world has changed. So I would say the two biggest things are the humanity of the people who try to communicate and the fragmentation of the media environment.
Let me add a piece of pre-COVID knowledge. So we content analyzed under a Rita Allen grant everything we could find on social media, on mainstream media. If it moved, we content analyzed it. And we asked, what is it that the public is getting as a receiving audience about science? This is pre-COVID. What it was getting was a discovery narrative. It was getting something exciting. It was in news, so it was exciting enough to get into news. Something exciting, and in general, it was wonderful. There was nothing bad attached to it. It perhaps was a cure, or it was something landing on a place so far away you couldn't even imagine anything getting there, and getting there with a precision that was astonishing. So across time, that discovery narrative bolsters confidence that science as an enterprise gives us useful knowledge, but also just knowledge that's exciting to know about our place inside humankind and inside a universe. Now, if you set that as the backdrop, what that narrative doesn't usually tell you is, and there's still unanswered questions, and that what we know may actually be overturned across time because we might find something brand new. It's a fixed narrative. This wonderful person came up with a great idea. He wasn't building on a whole lot of people. We don't do our job saying you build on everybody else's research, but on the back end, that there's still a lot that's unknown. Now, come into the COVID period. Suddenly, the dominant narrative isn't all that exciting, wonderful knowledge and the new discovery. It's instead watching science try to grapple with finding solutions to a pandemic. And so the public is now suddenly seeing a different kind of narrative with all of the limitations of science in process. And it doesn't bring the understanding that science is iterative, it's provisional, it's regularly updating, it's a moment snapshot in time of what we can know in the moment. And lots of different people are trying to know lots of different things, and it's being vetted. And some's going to survive and some isn't. And some, it's a very early stage of knowledge. You can't get to causal inference yet. Some is a little later, across time it's building. So this narrative comes in, and we forgot to tell the public every time we talked, this is what we know right now with all these limitations. These are all the unanswered questions. This is highly provisional. The scientific community had to deal with emergent knowledge, and the public was seeing that process, which inside the scientific community, you rarely see move with this kind of speed, with this kind of all hands on deck activity. And as a result, when people forgot to say, this is what we know right now, these are the unanswered questions. What we say right now may be overturned tomorrow as we find out about aerosolized transmission, as we find out that people who look healthy might actually be carrying a virus. So you might need to wear masks, everybody, because you might actually be able to transmit a virus even though you think you're healthy and everybody else around you thinks that you are as well. We forgot to bookmark. We forgot to say something the scientific community knew. It's iterative. It's provisional. They're unanswered questions. The public heard statements as a result as they know it. When we knew we didn't, the scientific community knew we're still grappling. And then when new knowledge emerged, the scientific community forgot often to say what it knew and the other scientists knew. We changed the position because there was new knowledge. We're telling you this now because there is additional knowledge. And they forgot to explain what that knowledge was. Sometimes they'd explain it just once and think we would remember it all the other times. They said, you should mask now. They didn't hear, we believe everyone should mask now because we understand actually a risk of aerosolized transmission and of asymptomatic transmission. And as a result, we need to worry first about holding those masks for the first responders, but everybody who can mask should mask now. So science had the disadvantage of a narrative that built confidence in it in the presence of a narrative that was showing emergent knowledge. We hadn't put the predicates in to let the public understand that those statements weren't final, they were provisional, they were iterative, things were going to change. We also forgot to tell them basic things we do know. Viruses mutate. This vaccine might turn out to be less effective across time, in part because viruses mutate. This vaccine might be more like the flu shot. You might need multiple ones as opposed to just one like the MMR. So we forgot to tell the public things we knew from just our backdrop of knowledge. And that doesn't mean the scientists were being duplicitous or in some way attempting to confuse the public. They just forgot to put in place the presuppositions they had with each other that the public didn't already share.
Yeah, the three of you collectively have kind of depicted this perfect storm of challenges. One is the inherent, provisional, iterative, self-correcting nature of science, and the fact that there are people who are communication specialists, to Holden's point, and the information ecosystem is much more complex. People aren't reading the news, and scientists are humans. So with that, I would really like to move on to the Q&A. I know that the audience has already had some questions trickling in, and I'd also like to invite Alec to come back on screen so we can move to Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A, not the chat. And if you are going to ask more than one, please just separate them in the Q&A so they're easier to spot and address. And while the questions get posted, there are a few that came in as we were talking. Here's a clarifying question for Alec, and that is, how do you define Democrats and Republicans in the survey, and are there differences by education?
Yeah, so what we do often at the center is we include independents who lean to a party with those who identify with the party. So you're looking at Democrats and independent leaners and Republicans and Republican leaners. The reason we do that is independents overwhelmingly lean to one of the two parties, and those who do often hold attitudes and behaviors very similar to partisans themselves. And then, Eileen, what was the second part of your question there?
And how does it differ by education?
Yeah, education is a factor here, but some may be surprised that it's a relatively modest factor, particularly within parties. So, for example, among Republicans, there are hardly any differences in education and overall confidence levels in scientists. Among Democrats, you see a bit more of a difference with highly educated Democrats, those with a college degree. They're more likely to hold the strongest feeling of trust, this great deal of trust, and that is a pretty significant, on the order of 15 points or so, difference. But education matters, not quite so much as partisanship, at least in this current moment.
I find that finding so interesting and to me quite counterintuitive across parties, education being a differentiator among Dems, but not as much among Republicans. The next question, why don't I pitch this to Holden? And it is, how much damage do ethical breaches in science, I think cases of outright misconduct, have on the level of trust in science?
Yes, well, I think we probably won't really learn the impact of that until it's been a little longer and the researchers can assess that. But I think that we absolutely are in a new era of updating and correcting the scientific record. That's a positive in the long run because Dr. Jameson has done research that shows that the main thing the public wants to see is that scientists change their views in light of new data, and that can even overcome perceptions about whether we're biased because of our political views or other aspects of our identity. And so the fact that there's a lot in the news now about research papers being corrected and retracted, that will be a good thing, I believe, in the long run. And we are certainly trying to be as aggressive about it as we possibly can. Now, whether there's a short-term impact of people reading in the national newspapers that there was a problem at Harvard Business School or at Dana-Farber or at Stanford or all these celebrated cases that have happened, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the lessons of this survey and the last couple of years is that a lot of people don't read national newspapers anymore. So whether those things are being circulated in the other communications channels, I don't really know. But I am confident that being much more forthright about correcting the scientific record, as we have been doing, and as people who analyze scientific papers have been helping us with, and as the authors are slowly learning is in their best interest in the long run as well, I think that's a very important errand for building trust in science in the long term.
Thanks, Holden. I wanted to go to sort of with a question that came in before the webinar, and relatedly, it's about the STEM workforce pipeline, and by that I mean young people. And what are some of the factors that could be increasing distrust in science among young people? And what are some effective measures to counter that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it really should be described as as a series of pathways, not necessarily a pipeline. I think that's one of the reasons why it's difficult for young people to even think about science, right? If you have to be in 7th grade algebra 2, or you're never going to be an engineer, then we've made a huge mistake as a country. There should be alternative ways onto becoming a scientist, and then lots of different ways to use that science background. I think for young people, one key thing is to relate to a scientist, and that is a hard thing to do if you've never met one, if you've never seen one in action, and what you're basing it on is what you've seen in TV and movies or on social media. And so one of the things that I really respect is when scientists are a part of their community. We have there are upwards of more than 1 million scientists in this country, scientists and engineers who are working at all around in many different industries and many different sectors. As we show up at elementary schools and at PTAs and that sort of thing, that matters. That shows the ability to be a part of our communities and to build trust, not just with adults, but also with children as well. I think the awe is a key thing as well. All children love to be inspired. And frankly, I like to be inspired too. And so when you see an image from the James Webb Space Telescope, you know what? The awe that's created, the idea that they can see an atmosphere on a planet outside our galaxy, it is incredible watching young people take that in, soak it up, and say, "I want to do that too." And there's just a tiny bit of trust that gets gained, but it's gained in spoonfuls. And so when it's lost through ethical breaches or retractions or miscommunications or misinformation, it's lost in buckets. And so we have to be building it constantly.
Yeah, and I love the pathways, not pipeline analogy. Another one I've often used is jungle gym, not ladder. So to take your point that it's the awe and the exposure and relationships, whether it's on a jungle gym or on pathways, I take your point and I appreciate that. I think that one of the questions that's come up, changing gears a little bit, is to what extent are views on scientists driven by a fundamental lack of understanding of how science works, i.e., public expectations based on misunderstanding of science are not met because science doesn't actually work that way, and public trust is degraded. So, is science education part of the problem? And why don't I pitch that to Kathleen first? Is science education part of this problem?
We haven't done as good a job as we ought to about helping everyone understand how science knows what it knows. There's been a focus across time in ensuring that people know what they need to know about the science, but understanding the structures of science that protect its integrity over time, the processes by which one moves from an understanding in a single instance to a larger population, to a controlled relationship, to get rid of confounding variables, to ultimately get randomized placebo-controlled trials, and as a result, a more reliable kind of knowledge, isn't as well known or as well taught. We did a really interesting little study that showed that when people were shown the structure by which the science is protected, and this is a second point, all the iterative steps that one goes through before a vaccine is certified, people were more likely to trust a new vaccine or report trusting a new vaccine. They didn't understand all those protective steps in place to overcome any biases humans might have introduced, because we're all humans in that process, or that a relationship to the pharmaceutical industry might have introduced. So understanding how we protect the knowledge is also a second part of scientific education, not just for schools, but for all of our communication. How we know what we know and what we do to protect that process is really important communication that hasn't been as well done as we ought to have done.
Yeah, those are really great points. I think we're just about at time, so I wanted to close with a lightning round question that I will give each of you the opportunity to give a brief response to. And I know it's going to be very hard when you hear what this question is, but here in the United States, we did have a big election not so long ago. And one of the participants asked, how do you think we should proceed in terms of continuing to try to shore up public trust in science, especially over the next 4 years? Why don't I start with Holden?
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, well, we have a lot of work to do. I mean, that's clearly the lesson of the last week and of really the last few years. And I think that we've got to dedicate ourselves to the core functions that we need to carry out as a scientific enterprise. And from my perspective, that's putting outstanding scientific information in journals and in the scientific record. And that is caring for the welfare of the scientific enterprise. So those things are well within our wheelhouse. During the pandemic, a lot of people, including me, were sharing their innermost thoughts all the time on social media. It was a good response to the stress that we were under, and it kind of brought people together. But there are very specific things that we control, that we are responsible for, and we need to focus on those and get people to understand that, and of course, it's always been true. That is where we spend almost all of our professional time. And we need to do a better job of showing people what that is.
Thanks, Holden. Kathleen, what are your thoughts?
We live in a time of lower trust in institutions in general, lower confidence in expertise in general. And if we're going to try to increase the amount of beneficial knowledge, the best of what's known at the moment, we're going to have to increase the number of times that people turn reliably to people they trust at the local level. The biology teacher who's teaching the high school biology class, the local healthcare provider. These people have high trust in their communities, within the community that needs to get the most useful scientific knowledge that we have at the moment, with all the provisos about it being time limited, provisional, and subject to updating. We're going to be rebuilding what trust has been lost, I think, by building up at the local level as we restore confidence in the concept of expertise and institutional spokespersons.
Thanks, Kathleen. And Steve, you have the final word.
Thanks. I'll just say I agree with both of them, but I'll add one thing, which is that we live in this extraordinary moment in time when things are moving so quickly. The gains from science and technology are coming so quickly that it's sometimes hard to keep up for all of us. And so regardless of who won last week's election, 2 weeks ago election, we have to do pretty much the same thing, which is we have to see if we can take that chaos of the world that we've created because we are moving so quickly, and how can we put structure around it, how can we put education to it, how can we put humility into our communication such that we can make sense of it. And that's what we're going to have to do no matter who's president, no matter who is running scientific agencies. It's going to be a complicated time because of our success.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I would like to thank all of our participants and panelists. We really appreciate all of the insights and expertise you shared with us today. And thanks to everyone for joining, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Eileen.